Moving countries can be one of the most exciting and most challenging things you'll ever do. And we're here to take one big worry off your plate: your taxes. At Expat Taxes, we understand the complexities of Irish tax from your perspective as an expat and tailor our advice to your needs. With decades of expertise, our team at Expat Taxes will help you navigate tax residency, cross-border taxation, reliefs and returns, and will work with your country's tax advisor to make sure your taxes are sorted. Whether you're an individual or a corporation coming from Australia, the United States, the UK, or anywhere in the world, we want to help you. So visit us at expattaxes.ie to book a consultation today, and let's make moving to Ireland easier together.
Welcome to Tax Bites for Expats, the top tax tips you want to know as an expat. The podcast is here to help answer the common queries and concerns expats have when moving to or from Ireland. Complex taxes explained simply. We'll focus on the Irish and international tax issues to be aware of to ensure you save time, money and stress.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Wickham from expattaxes.ie. You're listening to the Tax Bites for Expats podcast, the show that explains the do's and don'ts of income taxes for people who are moving to or from Ireland. So welcome to Tax Bites for Expats, and today's episode we are going to focus on an area that's become really relevant during the pandemic, and that's when somebody decides to come to work remotely in Ireland for their employer. And we've seen so much of this. It's become very common that I think maybe Irish people who'd moved overseas many years ago have decided that the time's right to come back and work remotely for their employer. And I suppose in the face of the great resignation and remote working generally, employers are much more open to the idea from what we can see in the market. So we're speaking to Laura Sant of CA Tax International, who we have spoken to before. Thanks so much for joining us again, Laura.
No worries, Stephanie. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, it's great to have you on again. And for anybody who hasn't listened to us before, Laura's background is a very interesting one. This is an area she specialises in. You work solely with expats in the UK, Laura, isn't that the case?
Pretty much, yes. Anybody who's either come into or out of the UK, as an expat, and has kind of UK sources of income and UK tax reporting obligations, that's kind of my little area of speciality.
Busy area. So many people moving around the world now that the borders have reopened. So I suppose there's so much we could talk about, and we had a great chat the first time we caught up, but today we'll focus very much just on these tax issues that arise when somebody, has decided with their employer's approval that they're going to work remotely from Ireland and the employer is UK based. I know you've lots of experience in this area, Laura, and we've lots to talk about. But I suppose maybe just to kind of set the scene from an Irish perspective, it would be good to kind of step through the issues that somebody needs to think about when they come to work in Ireland. And what we generally see is that I think the key message is if you're coming to work in Ireland for a UK employer, if you've moved back to Ireland for permanently or for a longer period of time, the expectation should be that you're going to start paying Irish taxes. So that's probably the first thing. I think it's just best to kind of start with that, isn't it? In other words,
yes,
that's really what today's session is about. The method is in kind of the detail. In other words, the specifics of each individual's case really matter, and it's probably really important in this episode to stress that you do really need to get advice on this. But Laura, from your perspective, we've set the scene. The Irish tax is the one that people need to be aware is coming for them, and I'll talk about that as we kind of go through it. But what are the things that you say to people when you speak to somebody? Maybe let's use an example. They say, I've moved to Ireland. I'm working remotely in Ireland for my UK employer. What are my tax issues? What do I need to think about? Where do you start when someone says that to you?
So normally if somebody is coming to me asking me those sorts of questions, the first thing that we'll talk about is where the income is considered to be sourced, because I think this is a big area of confusion with people. The main reason being is There are instances where it's very clear. So, for example, you have a UK employer, you're working in the UK. It's very clear that that income is based in the UK, and the UK is going to want to tax it. Similarly, if you've got an Irish employer and you're working in Ireland, very clear that Ireland's going to want to tax it. But what happens if you have a situation where you are based in Ireland working for a UK employer, or vice versa? And a lot of people are under the misconception that actually that income would be considered to be sourced where your employer is. So if you're in Ireland working for a UK employer, they'll say, well, I have UK income. And actually that source, or that income, is going to be considered to be sourced to where you are physically undertaking the work. So if you are working in Ireland, it's a UK source of income. The reason why that's important is it's because that will determine who has the primary right to tax that income. And probably it kind of leads on to your side, Stephanie, in terms of the Irish side, and the fact that Ireland are going to want to tax that income at that point.
And Laura, I think it's really good to kind of, you mentioned primary source, primary right there. And, for anybody listening hasn't got a tax technical background, this is a really interesting concept that kind of comes up very often, is that, we don't need listeners to be experts on tax law, but it is possible, and it often happens with many types of income and gains, that both the location where the income is sourced and the location where somebody is tax resident, if those two places are different, can retain a taxing right on a source of income. I mean, that's a fair point, isn't it? And I think it's about understanding, for example, if you're working for an employer, is the income only sourced in Ireland now? In other words, are you only going to be working in Ireland? Or if you are planning to go back and forth to the UK, is some of the income going to retain a UK source? And then once we determine that, we can understand then if both countries have the right to tax the income, and how that's going to work.
Exactly. And within the UK-Ireland double tax treaty, there is an employment income article, and within that there is what we would in the business would know as a short-term business visitors agreement, that could hypothetically exclude some income from being taxable in the UK, even if you're working in the UK. However, if your employer is based in the UK and it's the UK entity that is paying for your salary, any UK work days that you undertake, as long as they're part of your regular job, they are going to remain taxable in the UK. And I suppose that's where lots of complexities can arise, because that is where both the UK, where the employer has a need to report in both the UK and in Ireland.
Yeah, it gets a bit complicated. To kind of overlay it into, I suppose, a real life example. I know we've kind of collectively had quite a few, but what we've seen, and I think it's great to see it, because you see people kind of taking some of the things that we all learned the hard way during the pandemic, wanting to maybe be closer to their family, or not wanting a long commute daily, or just kind of wanting to leave the city and move to a greener place potentially. And a lot of Irish people, and not necessarily just Irish, but maybe people who are wanting to move to Ireland from the UK, have maybe moved outside the larger Irish cities. They've bought a property, they've sold their UK home, and decided to kind of move their life to Ireland. And the conversation with the employer is usually pretty good, because the employer goes, okay, you've been with the company for X number of years, we want to keep you, we will work with you, this is fine. And then what we find is the employee will approach us and say, can I just deal with my taxes myself? And it's about then kind of guiding them to the fact that, this is not just what you're going to do, it's also that your employer has a responsibility. And then the very first question I tend to ask them is, are you going to be sitting in your new home in Galway, working remotely from Monday to Friday for the UK employer, or will you get into the car on a Thursday evening, go to the airport and fly to the UK to maybe be there on a Friday, whatever way.
Yes.
So it's about kind of working out what's been agreed, what has the employer agreed to, and what way is it going to look. And that helps us deal with the next issue that I think we were going to talk about, which was around, reporting. How is the employer meant to report income, and where. I can talk about the Irish bit in a second, but from your perspective, what do you see happening, Laura, in that situation? Maybe where somebody's commuting back and forth to the UK.
So assuming that that the individual is going to be commuting back to the UK, then the reality is the employer still needs to be running some sort of a UK payroll. Now, if there's no kind of agreement in place with HMRC to do anything else, technically they should probably be operating a standard payroll and withholding tax on all of their employment income. However, if they do that and they're also operating an Irish payroll, then the person who's undertaking the relocation, your employee, they could then end up seeing virtually none of their income kind of on a real-time basis, and then look at the end of the year to claim back loads of taxes from both potentially from both countries. So there are different options that are available depending on how much time the individual will be coming back. As you said, we've dealt with a few different situations between the two of us. Historically, we have some people where there's normally an agreement in place with the employer. The expectation is that maybe you'll return, I don't know, maybe once every week for 1 day a week. Potentially you might return fortnightly, maybe even once a month, maybe even once every couple of months. And depending on how long you are spending back, and if there's a regular pattern to your returns that is expected, then it should be possible from a UK tax perspective to get an agreement in place with HMRC, so that you are so that the employer is only kind of processing an element of the employment income on a real-time basis. So let's say, for example, the plan is that you will be returning back once a week for 1 day a week, and that's all you're going to do in the UK. So that's 20% of your work is likely to be done in the UK. Then the employer can apply something called a Section 690 direction from HMRC, and can fundamentally then only look to tax 20% of your income at source. So there are kind of solutions that are available in the UK to try and minimise the kind of the direct impact on the employee, the kind of the downside from that perspective. And I'm sure later on we'll talk about what needs to happen at the year end. Sometimes the reality versus the expectation is very different.
And I think this is practically a difficult thing. It's a difficult conversation to have with your employer if they're not expecting it, because you've just hit on there the fact that, there may need to be a UK payroll if there's UK work days, and that can reflect the time that's been spent in the UK. From an Irish perspective, and we kind of touched on this at the start, really what we're saying to the employer or the employee is the UK employer now needs to register in Ireland to take Irish taxes. It's really as simple as that. When they need to do this is really a function of how long the employee is going to be here for. But broadly, if somebody's relocating to Ireland permanently, the employer needs to register at a point in time, and that involves them. It doesn't involve them having to necessarily set up an Irish company. This is kind of a misconception that I think sometimes employers have. I need to incorporate a company or, register a branch. That's not necessarily what Revenue have an expectation on. And I will include a little note there to say this is very much a function of what the employee is doing as well. I mean, we're not even going to talk about some of the corporate issues that can arise, the corporate tax issues. If you've got somebody who maybe is in a decision-making capacity for the company, it can be slightly different. But assuming that's not the case, an Irish payroll needs to be set up. That involves registering with Revenue and ensuring, if it's a monthly pay, that there's a monthly payroll run in euro. Essentially the tax needs to be transferred to Revenue in euro. So practically one of the questions that comes is, okay, so, am I now essentially having tax taken from my salary that is in euro, but I'm being paid in GBP? These little kind of gritty things that are a little bit difficult to kind of get a process in place, but not impossible. It's just more about understanding there's a little bit of legwork involved to get this up and running. And we're not even going to talk today about the other options. We've seen lots of employer of record type arrangements on the market now, which are essentially allowing the employer to, in some ways, outsource this problem. And we might just do another episode on that. But I think on the topic of real-time reporting, I would summarise what you said and my comments there as there needs to be payroll in Ireland, definitely. There might need to be payroll in the UK, and your employer, whether they like it or not, are going to have to do a little bit of legwork to make sure that they have a bit of a process, in their payroll team to make sure this all works smoothly. Would you agree with that?
I would, and I would also say, I think in terms of that real-time reporting, the obligation actually falls on the employer and not the employee.
Yeah.
Certainly from a UK tax perspective. So yes, I would say that realistically, if you are an individual who is looking at this kind of setup, you're considering relocating back to Ireland and want to get things right, you need to have a conversation with your employer at the start to make sure that they're not falling foul of any of their obligations.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And from an Irish perspective, Revenue are quite clear. They can penalise employers who don't do what they're meant to do. So we did see some leniency during the pandemic. That leniency is, it's not stated on Revenue's website anymore. I personally think, and this is only my personal view, that when we look at the way legislation is written, not just in Ireland, within the UK and kind of globally, none of it really ever anticipated kind of the digital era that we live in now. You look at, obviously, the OECD are doing so much work on kind of digital taxation and the concepts of, where is value created at a corporate level. But for individuals now, did we ever envisage a time when you could live in Galway and log on 5 days a week for your London employer and potentially only have to show your face? Well, actually, you show your face on Zoom, but only get on a plane maybe twice a month.
Yep.
We just never saw it. And, the people who wrote these tax treaties in the 60s and 70s, well, they definitely didn't see it. So, the processes, I think, lag behind the reality. And that's just common across all different types of government area. It takes time for public policy and, legislation to catch up with what's happening. But hopefully, not today's topic at all, but you'd hope in future it might get a bit easier. I hope it does.
Fingers crossed. I think as well, Stephanie, I think it's been accelerated by the pandemic. If you think pre-pandemic, the majority of companies who would be, I suppose, fundamentally considering cross-border employment taxes, you'd be looking at multinational companies who would be working with the Big Four in order, like, on their global populations to ensure that things kind of are being reported accurately. Whereas with the pandemic, it's driven a lot of smaller employers to go online to be able, or to enable their workforce to work remotely because they had to as a result of the pandemic. And I suppose it's one of those where as soon as people realised, actually, I can work remotely, and certainly with the pandemic, people wanted to be close to their families. They wanted to get back to generally to their home country, so they were near to people in case anything should happen. It makes sense that's probably sped up this process.
Yeah,
far faster than those that write double tax treaties and the likes would have kept up with.
And I often think as well, maybe just from a purely human perspective, when you speak to an employee and an employer, because we work with employers as well who want to do this, you can see everybody wants this to work. That's the thing. And I often say to people when they kind of arrange a consult with us, I say, you're not on your own. People often feel like, this is just such a mountain to climb. It's not actually that difficult with the right help. It's just really about taking your situation, being clear about what's going to happen in Ireland and in the UK, and having a bit of a process and having something that essentially is going to help the whole process work smoothly. That's in my mind. And then that lends itself to the next point we were going to talk about, which is the year-end bit. What's your thoughts on what happens at the year-end? I definitely have comments on that, but what are yours?
So I think, once again, taking from past experience, we've had people who maybe we were having conversations with in 2020 about their plans to relocate. And at the time, they had made agreements with their employers that they would maybe, say do 20% of their work back in the UK. So the employer's been on a real-time basis. They get the agreement, and basically once the agreement is in place, they generally, from a UK side anyway, have to operate per that agreement. They can't kind of mix it up. However, and in the majority of instances that I've been seeing, while the agreement has maybe been 20% of the time would be spent working in the UK, maybe there's only been a handful of days actually spent in the UK. So what that means is that in the UK, or on a real-time basis, the UK is actually taxed a decent chunk of somebody's salary, whereas the reality is only a few of those physical UK workdays should have been taxed. So it's your employer's obligation to do things right per, I guess, the UK and the Irish tax authorities. It's then the employees, the individual's obligation to get things right at the end of the year. So a reconciliation is going to be required. And as I say, in the majority of instances that I've been seeing, normally what that will mean from a UK tax perspective is you would then file a tax return to demonstrate that actually a big chunk of the income that has been taxed at source shouldn't have been taxed at source, and therefore from a UK side you're due a refund, which sounds good, but I'm guessing once you've talked about the Irish side, Stephanie, you'll find out it isn't necessarily quite so advantageous.
This is where I think, particularly at the moment, where we're kind of seeing a lot of these rearrangements kind of, the rubbers hit the road, so to speak. In other words, the processes for some employers are up and running, and now we're into tax returns. That refund that you're talking about is probably due to the Irish Revenue Commissioners. So you don't want the employee to get too excited and go, oh, I'm getting a refund. And firstly, you want them to have the refund back before they have to settle anything in Ireland. So
yes,
timing is crucial, because, I generally find, and this is probably something the listeners to this episode will think, is, what does the client want to know? Well, they firstly want to know, can I do this? Yes, you can. A bit of work required by your employer, potentially by you, to bring them to the party. Secondly, what's it going to cost me? Well, simply put, you're going to start paying taxes in Ireland at the Irish rates. So the refund that we're talking about in the UK, we anticipate is going to need to go towards an Irish liability. That's essentially what the comment is there. And then thirdly, I would say, don't underestimate how frustrating this can be if you leave everything to the last minute. And the reason I say that is, we had a chat yesterday about how long it can take to get refunds of foreign tax or tax back from the UK. I know revenue at the moment are the same, not issuing refunds particularly quickly. Of course, there's due diligence that they're doing behind the scenes, but the point being, approach this in a timely manner and you'll find it a lot less stressful. That's what I would say to clients if they
exactly. And I think there is plenty of time. So from a UK tax perspective, you can file tax returns straight after the end of the tax year, so from the 6th of April onwards. And am I right in thinking, Stephanie, that the Irish tax liability wouldn't be due until back end of October?
Yeah, and I think that's a little bit of a difficult question to answer definitively, but in terms of whether there should have been a withholding at source on it in the first place. But if an individual is settling a tax liability that they have on an Irish tax return, the tax return is due by the 31st of October in the year following the Irish tax year, which is calendar based. So a disconnect there between the Irish and UK years.
Yes.
And this is where I think having two advisors work together, what you really want is somebody to kind of take this off your desk and to work with a UK partner so that they work out the timing and, essentially what needs to be paid to who, so that you as a client aren't left with a tax bill that you hadn't anticipated and that needs to be funded at short notice, for example.
Exactly, and I'm sure you'll be aware, Stephanie, working with different jurisdictions as well. There's very much certain times of year where you get busy with clients from particular countries in order to kind of get them sorted so they can get their refund in time to settle any liabilities owing.
Definitely, yeah. The fun and games.
It is.
So I think, we're nearly up on time, but, Social Security, and actually before I even say this, I think it's really important to be really clear here that this is focusing very much on a very small part of this topic, which is the cross-border income tax piece. We're going to talk about social security now, but I often say to people too, there's lots of issues that arise when somebody works remotely for a foreign employer under a foreign employment contract. Insurance issues, potentially GDPR, health and safety, employment law, an area I am not an expert in, and one I don't provide advice in. But the point is, it's easy to focus on, the cash part here and forget about the other issues, and that's something that an employer needs to do. They need to, and they would do that generally if they sent somebody to work in a new location, which is essentially what's happening here. But an area we do talk about, social security, and that was one of the topics we wanted to mention, Laura.
Yes, and I think it's probably only worth a very quick mention, but obviously if payroll is being processed in both countries, I suppose the starting point, unless any agreement is reached, is that social security or national insurance would be payable in both countries. The reality of that is not that you wouldn't be paying it in both countries. There is an agreement in place between the UK and Ireland, and as a general rule of thumb, you would end up paying your social security in the country in which you live. So usually there's a bit of administration just to kind of get yourself set up, and Stephanie, from an Irish perspective, would you say that would fall on the employer again?
To pay social security here? Yes, of course.
No, to get the. Sorry, I was more thinking along the lines of the A1 certificate.
Oh, right. Yes. So essentially, and look, this is an interesting point because, the protocol between Ireland and the UK, to the extent that we're looking at A1 certificates, is sometimes talking about like a posted worker. And I suppose there's a question as if an employee has initiated a move, are they in reality a posted worker? And is A1 really due? Perhaps a slightly technical question, but I generally anticipate or see that if somebody's moving from the UK to Ireland, that the employer would start to pay into the Irish system and the employee would also do that. But obviously that's a function of, the length of time they're coming for. Again, it's like everything, isn't it? It's facts and circumstances. One point I do generally say is the Irish employer rate of PRSI, which is the equivalent to national insurance, is lower, isn't it, than the UK one? It's roughly 11% here.
Yes, it is. 13.8% at this precise moment. I think they've just changed it back.
Yeah, so in one of their weekly budgets. Okay, so quite a lot to what we've discussed and loads more that we could talk about. But to boil it down, I would say if somebody wants to walk away from this episode with a little bit of a distilled summary of what we've discussed, I would say, Laura, and you correct me if I'm wrong, get advice from someone who's done this before. That's what I would say to somebody, because the amount of time and money that can be wasted trying to bring parties to the table who are not familiar with this process it's a bit mind-boggling how complicated it can become, but how simple it can be with the right advice. And then the second point that I think you brought out really well was, the payroll considerations and the withholding on that are really the employer's responsibility. The employer can never pass that to the employee in an employment arrangement. And that, essentially, as you very well brought out, in the UK, the employee needs it to be right at the end of the year. They would be doing a UK tax return to kind of sort that out. I think that was your point on that front.
Yes. Yeah.
And, even if the employer has registered, when they do that tax return, there might still be a balance due at the end of the year, and whether that's in Ireland or the UK is really just a function of the facts, but ultimately that's the message. And I think what I have said, hopefully it's clear, is if you were resident in Ireland, it's the Irish tax rate is the one that, you want to focus on. That's the cash cost of living and working in Ireland in the majority of cases, with some small exceptions. But yeah, I think that's it, Laura. I mean, lots to talk about. I know your contact details will be in the show notes.
Yes, been lots of fun.
Yeah, as fun as tax can be.
Yes, and I suppose the very last point is just it is possible to do it if it's an option that you're currently considering, but it's not necessarily going to be a piece of cake. There's going to be a little bit of work involved in terms of getting everything set up.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. I will obviously do it again, but really appreciate you joining us and hope you have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Steph.
Thanks for listening to Tax Bites for Expats. Please do leave a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcast. And as always, remember to take professional tax advice specific to your personal circumstances before acting or refraining from action in connection with the matters dealt with in this series. The material in this podcast is intended to give general guidance only.